All right, well, welcome back to another installment of Chatting with some of our scholars. I'm Alexis Wagoner. I am the Marketing and Digital Education Director for Westar, and today I'm going to be talking to Dr. Stephen Patterson, who is the Atkinson Chair of Religious Studies at Willamette University in Oregon. And Steve, you have a new book called The Forgotten Creed, Christianity's Original Struggle Against Bigotry, Slavery, and Sexism, and I will put the link to that in the description of the video. But the contention of the book, as I understand it, although I have not read it, but as I understand it, is that, before we get to Christianity being creedal in the way we sometimes think of it with the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed and those sorts of things, you have this contention that there was this wholly other sort of creed that helps address some of the issues around these ideas of bigotry, slavery, and sexism. So I would love to just hear you talk about what that is and how you would describe it, and I will let you take it from there.
Okay, thank you, Alexis. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Yeah, the Forgotten Creed is a little creed, a baptismal creed originally, we think, that is embedded in one of Paul's letters, the letter to the Galatians. And since Paul didn't write it, we think of it as a pre-Pauline thing. So it's arguably the first Christian creed. There are a few other little creedal statements in Paul's letters that could compete for that title, if you will. But this is certainly a contender. And it's little thought of in those terms, though, because it never really became part of Christian creedal life, if you will. It's in Galatians 3, verses 26 and 28, and Paul dresses it up quite a bit, so there's a lot of stuff in it that's not original to it. So one of the things I do is I reconstruct it, and reconstructed, the creed is more or less like this. You are all children of God. There is no Jew or Greek, there is no slave or free, there is no male and female, for you are all one. In the middle of it, in Paul's version, there's a little statement about baptism, which is how we know that, or why we think it was originally a baptismal creed. But what I think is interesting about it, besides there's a lot of things that are interesting about it. One is that it doesn't say anything about who God is or who Christ is, or there's nothing confessional about it in that sense. It's all about who you are, that is the person who is being baptized, and your identity, your solidarity with others who are also being baptized. Secondly, it's built on an ancient cliche that we know of from other contexts. Mostly people refer to the Jewish version of it when they talk about that cliche, but I like to talk about it in terms of the Roman and Greek versions, because it was culturally pretty deep-seated. The cliche was expressed something like this: I thank God every morning that I was not born free and not a slave, that I was born Roman and not a barbarian, that I was born a man and not a woman. Sort of expressing the ancient native freeborn male's sense of privilege and power in the ancient world. So this creed flips that on its head and says there is no Jew or Greek. That's ethnicity, of course. There is no slave or free. That's class, if you will. There is no male and female, for you are all one. So race, class, gender, those are I think, the three big ways by which the human community divides itself one from another. And this creed is dedicated to finding some solidarity beyond all of that.
Yeah. So what happened? So how do we end up with some of these other, not that there's not value in them, but some of these other more elaborate creeds versus ones that seem to attack some of these issues of oppression more head on?
Yeah. This is the book is another what the hell happened here type book, and that's a big part of the book, is asking the question if anybody ever took this creed seriously.
Sure.
And if they did, how and then what happened over time.
Yeah.
There is no there is no Jew or Greek. That is something that people have for the last 30 years come to regard as extremely important in understanding the Apostle Paul.
Hmm.
The whole idea of justification by faith was designed to, or intended to include Gentiles in a largely Jewish movement. So that the question of what happened to that is a question of what happened to Paul's original message. And what happened was that the Jesus movement became a Gentile movement, largely Gentile, for various reasons. But the Jewish presence became so small that it became really a Gentile movement. And so the question of whether or not Gentiles would be welcome became moot. Nobody asked that question anymore. And so there is no Jew or Greek. It wasn't really a relevant question after the 2nd century. And as Christians began to differentiate themselves against Jews, then that idea, there is no Jew or Greek, became simply there is no Jew. There is no longer Jew. Jews are, and Judaism is something of the past. So we begin to talk about the Hebrew scriptures as the Old Testament, for example, and relegate all of that to a bygone era.
Right.
You can see that happening already in the New Testament, especially in the Acts of the Apostles, where Christians begin to say the Messiah came to the Jews rejected the Messiah, and now we are turning to the Gentiles. So the second, there is no slave or free. It's hard to know if that was ever taken seriously. We find references to slavery in Paul's epistles, but he is so vague whenever he almost dissembles when he begins to talk about slavery, that the things he says you can translate into English in really 180-degree different ways.
Right.
And that's what people did. 1 Corinthians 7, for example, is like this. What does Paul mean when he says, you were bought with a price, do not become slaves of human beings? Does he mean that literally? Does he mean it metaphorically? You can take it either way. In the famous epistle to Philemon, where he's negotiating the future of a slave named Onesimus, he never actually says to Philemon what he wants him to do. He doesn't say, free Onesimus or anything like that. It seems almost as if he's saying, I would like Onesimus to come back and serve me. So it may be that Paul's even wanting a slave of his own. We know that there were Christians that did take seriously the idea that there is no slave or free. The first mention we have of Christianity is in pagan literature, is in Pliny's letter, of course, and he talks about capturing 2 leaders of the Christiani to torture them to find out what they actually do in their meetings, and he describes them as 2 female slaves. So there's a group that is led by female slaves, and that's really interesting, I think. And in the 2nd century, there's the most popular Christian writing was a thing called the Shepherd of Hermas. Little known today, but in the 2nd century, it was probably the most widely read Christian work. And it is ascribed to a slave or a freedman, someone who was a foundling, that is, had been exposed as a baby and raised as a slave. And so the whole work is kind of from the perspective of a slave. But of course, with time it became clear that Christians were not going to manumit their slaves. And by the 2nd century, again, we have clearly stated in places like 1 Peter and 1 Timothy, let slaves be obedient to their masters, because in doing so, you are being obedient to God. And that sets the tone for Christianity and slavery for 2 millennia. Those arguments are still used in the 19th century to justify slavery in the United States. Finally, male and female, that's an area that has gotten lots and lots of attention in the last 30 years. And so we know a lot now about early Christianity and the role of women in the movement but how it came that women dropped out of leadership.
Right.
Sometimes it's said that women dropped out because that's just the way things were, and Christianity wouldn't survive if that weren't the case, and things like that. And but now we know that a lot of associations at the time, religious associations or just funerary associations, had women as leaders, and
Yeah.
philosophical groups like the Epicureans honored women as leaders, and we even know of Jewish women leaders in synagogues in the diaspora. So it's not the case that the whole world was patriarchal. It was predominantly patriarchal, and that's why Christianity becomes a patriarchal religious structure. But it's not like there weren't options. And
Right.
so we know now that Christian leaders had an argument, and the patriarchal faction won. And
Right.
we still live with that today. 95% of all churches worldwide are run by men. There are no women priests or leaders in these churches. Only a small little slice of liberal mainline Christianity in the United States and Europe ordains women today, as you well know. So I think that all of this makes it hard for the church to find relevance in the 21st century. And people wonder if there are things in our tradition that could be helpful to us as we try to find our way in the modern world. And I think this is a tradition that we should pay attention to.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me and personally troubling as well, since I, also sort of have a, stake in the game, that, as you say, like some of these things that show up in Paul, you find something completely the opposite, also Paul, or attributed to Paul, or in the, in the Pauline way, and yet the things that we have seized on, especially in the modern Western church, as you say, for the last 2 millennia, are the interpretations that are more narrow, more exclusionary, more biased, more oppressive. And I don't know that there's necessarily, I don't know if that's a question, I don't know if there's necessarily an answer to that, but it is interesting, like how that seems to happen. And yet, as you're indicating, the roots of something completely different from that are also present, and we haven't latched on to that per se.
Right. And the irony, of course, is that the authentic Pauline letters, First and Second Corinthians and First Thessalonians, Philippians, Romans, Galatians, Philemon. These letters, this is where we find evidence for women's leadership. For example, Romans 16 being a very important example of this. Philippians was that the community of Philippi was clearly led by 2 women. So it's in the authentic letters that we have the evidence for a more, should we say, visionary interpretation of Christian faith. And in the inauthentic letters, the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus especially, but also in Colossians and Ephesians, you already have a polemic against slavery and women as leaders. And so scholars widely consider these letters to be forgeries today. But we have trouble dealing with them because they are in our scriptures. And what do you do with a part of your scripture that is a forgery? You know it. We've just not been able to come clean about that. And, I don't know what to do, to tell you the truth. Except just keep saying that within scripture you have a trajectory, and that trajectory is tending to more conserving, tending to more patriarchal, tending to more hierarchical, and that's not a trajectory that we recognize today as the right trajectory. Some people do, of course, but many of us, I assume that you and I are agreed on this, that that's not the trajectory that is the future for our civilization or for our churches.
Right. And the other thing too that I, because this is the way I grew up in the patriarchal kind of side of things, that Paul is so revered, and you're right, they would never even consider the idea of like saying forgery and scripture, like, side by side. There is such a heavy emphasis on Paul that it's almost at the exclusion of the emphasis on Jesus. And you can find some of what I would consider maybe antidotes to some of these problems in Jesus' teaching, and yet there's this huge primacy placed on the teachings of Paul, and so you're kind of left going like, well, why are we following this as opposed to the original teacher here?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that part of the reason, of course, is that Paul was organizing communities, and so these ideas and about organization and who should lead and who should not, those things come up in Paul where they don't come up in Jesus.
Yeah.
I do ask in each of these cases, each of these areas, ethnicity, slavery, gender, what Jesus would have thought about these things, and it's sometimes a little hard to tell.
True.
In terms of ethnicity, Jesus never wandered very far beyond the Galilee, so his experience would have been relatively limited. Although we know that there were Gentiles living in the Galilee, so he would have had lots of opportunity to interact with Gentiles. It's just that it never comes up that much. And when it does come up, say in the Gospel of Mark, there is a big thing in Mark about interacting with Gentiles, but it's probably because Mark was written under the influence of a Pauline version of the gospel, which was open to Gentiles. So we just don't know what Jesus' view of these things was on ethnicity. In terms of slavery, again, we just don't have anything. Jesus, in his parables, slaves appear as stock characters, and they don't seem to fare any better than slaves do in other people's stories. So there's no reason to think that Jesus was focused in on slavery as an evil. He doesn't tell any stories about slaves being freed. But again, we don't know if that's because Jesus had no ideas about it, or if it's being filtered through a set of texts that had already decided that you can't question the realities of slavery. In the Shepherd of Hermas, there are parables that are very similar to the parables of Jesus that are told from the point of view of slaves. And it's interesting. You get an idea of what a parable of Jesus would sound like if a slave were telling it. The master goes away, tells the slave to tend the vineyard. He comes back. The slave has tended the vineyard very well and built a wall to boot. And the master says to the slave, "Oh, you've done such a great job. I've decided that I'm going to make you co-heir to my estate." And then his son comes in and learns about this, and you would think that the son would be angry, but no. And the slave telling, the son is overjoyed. It's, "Oh, I love this guy. He's a wonderful slave, and I'll be happy to have him as co-heir to the vineyard." So you could tell the stories of Jesus like this. They might be slightly less realistic, but there is a way of thinking about these things, but we just don't have that from Jesus.
Yeah.
And finally, on women, that is a phase. There's a phase now. We're at a phase of the scholarship about early Christianity and women that is really questioning the role of Jesus and how much he welcomed women into his followership. I'm of the view still that Mary Magdalene was the first or one of the first apostles, and that stories like the story of Mary and Martha do in fact depict women as students in the movement, as other disciples would have been. So I think that's a clearer thing we can see in the Jesus movement. But that's also disputed territory now. So you'd think that Jesus would give us good, clear guidance on race, class, and gender, but this little creed is about the only thing we have at that early phase that is so clear. And whether or not where it comes from, we don't really know. Jesus didn't baptize anybody, as far as we know. So it's unlikely that he would have composed a baptismal creed.
Yeah.
his head, or or he made it up himself. And so that leaves us with John the Baptist, where baptism originally comes from in the Jesus movement. And it's possible that this creed actually comes from the Baptist movement.
Hmm.
And Jesus would have embraced it as he became a follower of John the Baptist. That's just speculation, but I think it's quite likely, actually.
Interesting. Well, very interesting stuff. Thanks again, Steve. And the book is The Forgotten Creed, Christianity's Original Struggle Against Bigotry, Slavery, and Sexism, which again, I will link to. So again, thanks for your time and great discussion. I appreciated you being here.
Thank you, Alexis. Thanks so much.
You bet.